Hello and welcome to a lecture that I'm going to produce as a video for you. This is a lecture in the advanced video module, and it's on video and television art. And the way I'm going to do this is I will provide the PDF file of this slideshow presentation as usual. But this video will allow me to talk around the issues and intercut some live video, not live video, but some motion video, and just give you a better sort of perspective on this than just handing you a file. So welcome. This unit has a few different. Let me click on this here. This unit, just to give an overview first, I guess the history of video art is as old as video technology itself, but I'm going to break it down here into the methods and the practices before 1968 and after 1968. So I'm going to take that year as a cutoff date, and you'll see why when I talk about some of the technological changes that occurred around that time. And the focus of this is going to be on New York City. Now, I recognize that quite often the focus in arts literature is on New York and other big centers, ignoring the periphery, ignoring people that were doing good work elsewhere. In this case, however, there are a lot of reasons to focus on New York City, and certainly many video artists came out of that environment because there was a special combination of environmental forces that seemed to coalesce around this same time between 1966 and 1972. So the first section of this presentation then is going to examine the context. So I'm going to look at the state of television broadcasts, and particularly newscasts, and how those changed at this time. The effects of the Vietnam War, and particularly how this affected politics and was portrayed in the media, and the growing counterculture, as it was called, a new term at the time to describe the sort of anti-establishment forces that were arising in the USA and elsewhere in the late 60s. And then there were certain economic incentives. And all of these factors came together to make New York in particular a special place for the growth of a new art form. So before 1968, I like to talk about video art as signal art. And I'll explain why, because there was three particular methods that people could use at that time to operate on television apparatus or on video itself. There are a couple of specific pieces and practitioners I'll discuss. For example, Black Spiral, which I'll show you an excerpt from, which is very important to signal art. And the show, the exhibition, The Medium is the Medium. It was sort of a compilation of some of this work at the time. And then around 1968, there was the invention of this Portapak system that Sony brought onto the market that revolutionized what was possible with video. And there was, again, a show put together called TV as a Creative Medium, which I'll look at. In particular, one piece from that show, Wipe Cycle. And there were lots of other groups and forces, collaborative forces coming together at the Experimental Television Center in New York State, publishing the journal Radical Software. Lots of different forces, some of which I will look at in this particular lecture. And then finally, I'm going to just give you names of three of the sort of hardware gurus who made all this possible by designing custom hardware from scratch, which always takes a very special sort of talent and mind. People who themselves were artists or who worked with artists to enable what they could do. So this is quite a lot to cover in one lecture. And actually, I'm going to have a second lecture where I look at in more detail at some specific practitioners, but I thought that this overview was good to do in one big chunk. Okay, so that's what we have in store. So I'm going to start with an image here from Namjoon Paik and his piece TV Chair from 1968. You can see him sitting in the chair and very playfully. His work, I think, had a very playful quality. I'm not going to look at him in any great detail, even though he's the most obvious video artist to discuss. But it's important to sort of start with him and start with this great photo here. And a quote that proved to be quite prescient: "How long before every artist is his own television station?" So there was a utopian aspect to what television and video could do for people, both culturally, politically, and artistically. And I think in our time, every artist is their own television station, or at least can be on YouTube. So this is one of those sort of predictions. It wasn't really a prediction, but it did come true in a sense. So first of all, then, the context. So prior to 1968, it was very expensive to get your hands on video equipment, and television broadcasting was certainly out of the hands of ordinary people because it took a huge investment. We're talking about, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, to use the US currency. So television was centralized in large corporations that would have branches around the country. Networks formed of these for distributing material, and the material was highly standardized into various program formats. So you had news gathering, documentary, entertainment formats, variety shows, comedies, and so on. But there was a growing awareness through the 60s, especially, of the impact of this on people, on the nation. How television controlled information and shaped worldviews by how it was presented. And I'll give one example of a study from that looked back at the time that showed that even back all those decades ago, if you were watching television, just the general run-of-the-mill evening programming, you were 50 times more likely to see a violent act committed than was true of the real world. So in the real world, an average person might only have, say, a 1% chance to encounter violence in any given day or year or whatever the number is. But on television, it was 50 times more likely because, of course, violence is dramatic. It's useful for narratives and so on. News focused on these sorts of events as well. So people grew up thinking the world was a lot more violent than it really was. And this trend has continued till today. And this inculcates in people certain feelings and certain ways of looking at the world. You're going to be more fearful. To be political, one might say that this suits governments who want to keep citizens in a certain state of fear so that the services the governments provide, say military and policing services, can be appreciated. And so without getting too much into that, this sort of media theory awareness combined with the political context rose to the fore in the 1960s. We also had practitioners like Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian theorist, who was putting forward proclamations like "the medium is the message" and so on. This is really the material from another unit, but I just touch on it here. And it's good to remember that news in particular was not what we are used to today. Before 1963, the evening national news in the USA was 15 minutes in length. And people tuned into that to get the highlights of the news. The rest they might read in the newspapers the following morning. But that's all you had of news. And in 1963, it was expanded to 30 minutes, which still is nothing compared to the media saturation of news we have today with, of course, 24-hour news stations and so on. At the same time, documentaries, which really had about zero popularity at the time, started increasing in popularity. And by documentaries, these would often be news discussion shows or panel shows, that type of thing. But again, documentary film just was nowhere compared to its popularity today. So it's good to know this. The context, the media context, was very different. But the average person in the USA learned through the television because the television was always on. It was on as background noise, as filler. It was on morning, noon, and night. And it really was the main way that people got their information. Unlike in other places such as Europe, where the newspaper was still the dominant mode of conveying information. So the USA was a particular case in point where television was adopted much more rapidly, much more pervasively than in other parts of the world. So again, at the time, news stories were still shot on film. So the film canisters had to be transported back to the stations. They had to be developed and edited, etc., before broadcast. So it was never the case that news was presented sort of as it was happening. There was a lack of this immediacy that we now take for granted with streaming on the internet and so on, and social media. So video changed this because video does not need to be developed. It doesn't go through a chemical process. It can be transported through phone lines, whereas film cannot. So the advent of video changed how immediately people could learn about events in the world. And one of these events that was of paramount importance was the Vietnam War, which actually lasted 20 years, according to the official designations of when it started and ended, and was a military intervention of the USA in South Vietnam, purportedly to fight off the communist incursions from North Vietnam. Now, in actual fact, the situation was much more complicated than that, with many countries involved, directly or indirectly, and it was it didn't end well for the USA. Let's just say they basically had to eventually leave with their tail tucked between their legs, and it caused a big supposed crisis in confidence in the USA and how they viewed themselves externally. There's a lot of debate about that, but it's certainly a lot of people were drafted for the war. It caused a huge impact domestically, and it was often called the first television war. About a quarter of all news material at the time was about the Vietnam War, which is a lot. Just like currently, at least a quarter of all our news coverage is about COVID-19. Perhaps half of it is about that, which is a lot, perhaps more than it deserves alongside other things that are going on in life. That remains to be seen and could be debated. But increasingly, as the immediacy of the war was brought home to people through their television sets, people started realizing what war is. People are dying, people are being hurt and treated in very cruel ways on different sides, mind you, of the war. The soldiers themselves that were going were in unbearable situations sometimes. And so the Vietnam War, in terms of media studies, is often held up as sort of the moment where this first happened, where television played this pivotal role. There are research articles on this that debate whether that was actually true. A lot of the famous images from the Vietnam War are actually still photos that were sent back by journalists and photographers on location. Those are the iconic images that have remained with people, not images from the television in actual fact. So there's a bit of debate about this, but I think there's no doubt that by the midway point of the war, as television coverage changed, it became really quite important. And US President Johnson, who was president through the period up till the early 70s, if I'm remembering correctly, he credited television with this impact, and in fact made the statement that the U.S. ability to wage an effective war that they might win was being crippled by the television coverage, which was almost certainly not true, but it was something that he was paying attention to. He was very aware of the role of media, and he apparently timed certain military offenses in Vietnam, so they didn't get too much attention domestically. He timed them with other famous events. So, for example, the Apollo moon landing, everyone was fixated to their televisions to watch that event. And so if something was happening in Vietnam that day, it would be ignored. Now, the domestic scene in the USA at the time had already become quite a conflict in itself. Numerous youth movements, sort of the sexual liberation of the 60s, the hippie culture, events like the Woodstock Music Festival in 1969, where huge amounts of young people got together to get down and listen to music in a muddy field. The whole political dissent, people burning their draft cards, not wanting to go to war, African Americans realizing they were being unfairly penalized in this effort, the assassinations of various political figures like Martin Luther King, changes in education, expansion and changes in the traditional family unit. All sorts of stuff was happening at that time, and the word that encompasses all of that would be counterculture, which was a new word really in use in the late 60s. And of course, the arts had a lot to do with this. The arts had a lot to do with this. It fed out of counterculture and it fed back into the counterculture to provide other modes of discourse, other ways of representing information, other ways of expressing personal freedom, sharing, inclusiveness, and so on. So many video artists that I'll mention later in the lecture were explicitly influenced by this. I mean, this isn't just some vague idea that this was in the air. No, I mean, some of them have said, I went to Woodstock, it changed my life, and so on. I'll give just a few examples as we come to them. And finally, there were economic incentives, particularly in New York. So the governor of New York State, Nelson Rockefeller, was seeking re-election in 1970. And as an incentive, he increased the budget for the arts from $2 million to $20 million. So he didn't just give artists a bit more money, he gave them 10 times as much money. You have to wonder why. I mean, did he really think he was going to get lots of votes from artists? Perhaps he did. And the pool that was allocated to video artists in particular was $500,000. And this is just in New York State, a place that basically had no video artists, or very few. Sorry, it had a few before 1970, but not that many people. So obviously this encouraged people to do the work. It allowed great creative freedoms. People could pay their rents without worrying about it. People could rent gallery spaces without worrying about it. And the artists at a time, because of the counterculture ideals, had a very open, free approach to sharing resources. So all these facts together created a lot of opportunities in a unique situation in New York City because of this budget that did not exist elsewhere. It didn't exist elsewhere in the USA or anywhere else in the world that I'm aware of. So it's not just that New York City is always held up as this exemplar of art for institutional reasons. There were all these particular factors that were going on at the time, and they were not irrelevant at all. They shaped the scene, and they created video art in essence. It might not otherwise have happened in the same way. So that is the context then. So the next section is on what I will call signal art, to be very precise. And signal art was really the only way that artists could engage with video and television before around 1968. Signal art operated on the actual mechanics of television sets and broadcasting, on the electronics, not so much on the content, because creating content, going out and filming or videotaping something, was still out of the reach of ordinary people or even artists with a bit of a budget. It simply took too much equipment like editing suites and studios and so on. It was just too expensive. So artists instead looked at sort of an engineering approach and a structuralist approach. And they used three methods in particular. Electron gun manipulation, and here's a photo of an electron gun. Actually, it's from an oscilloscope, not a television, but the idea is similar. Basically, electricity is used to power electrons out of a tube, and an electromagnetic field is used to point it in different directions. So anyway, I'll get to that a bit more in a moment. Electron gun manipulation, manipulation of the incoming signal, so signal processing. And then thirdly, direct signal synthesis, so creation of video signals from scratch as opposed to recorded material. So these were the methods that were open to artists and that some chose to engage with. So the first one, the electron gun manipulation, I mean, it helps to know how a television set works. It has this electron gun, as it's called, because it fires out high energy particles at the back of the screen, and that activates the phosphors and the different materials we used on screens actually at different times, but it activates those and lights them up. And it has to do this by scanning line by line from the top to the bottom of the screen, and then from left to right, or right to left, I guess it doesn't matter. But the scanning is done in a regular way with particular timings. There's the horizontal timing and the vertical timing. And these sync signals, synchronization signals, define the frame of television. And then what is put in that frame is the content. So the raster manipulation then could be achieved by directly influencing this electron gun. And you could do this, because it was an electromagnetic effect going on, you could do this with magnets. You could just hold magnets around a television set and alter the signal. Or you could permanently make modifications to the television set if you knew a good engineer. And this was very much like what we would call circuit bending, although they didn't use the term at the time. And Nam June Paik's work was very much using these sort of techniques, in particular his wobulator. And you can find out more at this address from the Experimental Television Center. I'm not going to go into any great detail, but I will show you a video in a moment that will illustrate some of what this could look like. So the second method used would be to process the incoming signal. And you could do this using a number of methods, which I've itemized here. These should be well familiar to us even today from digital video editing, but they were possible, quite some time ago, since the 40s or 50s anyway. So you could sequence signals, so just put one after another with edits in between. There was signal switching, which is actually just sequencing, but at fast rates that are under some oscillator control, so you could quickly cycle back between signals, back and forth. There was mixing, combining signals that are flowing at the same time. And then you've got fades and wipes and different ways of varying between switching and mixing. And then there are particular properties of video. So all the previous properties also would apply, say, to audio, but there's particular properties that only apply to video work, and which would even be harder to do on, say, film. One of these is keying, which is achieving a mask based on the lightness and darkness, the luminance. And then we have what we know, of course, as color keying or chroma keying, the green screen and blue screen work, which is masking achieved through the chrominance channel, or the color channel of the video. And finally, the technique of colorizing, which is adding color to a black and white signal, which was very common through the 60s, because most of the signals that artists were dealing with were in fact black and white to begin with, and color would have to be added as a separate stage in the creative process, which is something that's not sort of recognized today, because we're so used to working with color images from the get-go. Okay, so the third approach taken was signal synthesis. So this is very analogous to analog synthesis, in the sense that you can put together oscillators that generate waveforms, and if they are operating at the correct frequencies within the correct sync framework, you get a video signal from scratch, from nothing. You can modulate these, you can filter them, you can do all the same processes that you would with an analog audio synthesizer, but do it with a video synthesizers. And while I'm mentioning that word synthesizer, I have a note here with a misspelled word, unfortunately, but A lot of early video devices were called synthesizers, even if they didn't actually synthesize signals. In other words, they were misnamed. So, for example, Namjoon Paik worked with an engineer, Abe, on the Paik Abe video synthesizer, but it's not a synthesizer. It actually doesn't create signals from scratch. Instead, it's a mixer, it's a colorizer, it's not a synthesizer. So just to point out this confusion here in some of the nomenclature. Okay, so people doing this signal art, this early video art, had very few ways of getting this material out to the public. But there was a TV special that was put together by a station in Boston in 1968, that pivotal year, and it was called The Medium is the Medium, sort of playing off the McLuhan phrase, the medium is the message. And it included work by a number of really important artists, including Aldo Tambellini, whom I'm going to look at in a bit more detail. So Tambellini was from New York State. He was born in Syracuse, and he started working with engineers from Bell Labs, Tracy Kinsell and Hank Reinhold, their names. Often the engineers don't get the credit they deserve, actually, in all this. The artist gets the credit, even though the engineers are doing all the technical work. So I like to make sure both sides get, get appropriate credit. So his work was this electron gun manipulation. His early work was. So A, it was in black and white, and B, it involved this direct manipulation of the video signal in the television set itself using magnets. And what I'll do is I will play a little bit of this for you, Black Spiral from 1969. It's very abstract, of course. It's certainly not about conventional television imagery. Tambellini said, television is not an object. It's a live communication media. Black Spiral brings you live information. One day we will look at nature as the floating astronauts do in a spiral or circular form where no up or down or gravity exists. And the critic, Gene Youngblood, whom we'll hear from again in a bit, a very important writer, described this as a beautiful example of aesthetically manipulated video circuitry. The normal rectangular raster of the TV picture was transformed into a circular raster by modification of the circuitry from an XY coordinate system to a polar coordinate system. As a result, the broadcast picture appeared as a flowing spiral. Any movement in the picture caused the spiral to swoop and explode in giant gaseous curls of glowing phosphors. So that's quite a poetic description, and you may or may not have got that from the short amount of the film. It's 11 minutes long in total, the video. But certainly it's abstract. It is trying to get at these natural forms out of something completely unnatural, television, with all of its restrictions. And I do find it actually quite evocative for that reason. Certainly, it's hard to place ourselves back in 1969 to understand what this might have meant. Certainly it's quite conceptual in nature as well, one has to say. Not everyone's into that sort of stuff. Okay, so that I show you to represent this early signal art. And now I want to discuss the video art after this juncture of 1968. And this is the reason that year I chose that year. In 1967, Sony introduced the Portapak system, but their first widely available model was in 1968. And actually, Sony had previous models of portable video systems, but they weren't that portable. They still required at least 2 operators and so on. So if you look at the image, the idea here is you have a video camera with a built-in microphone that you can hold with one hand with an eyepiece to look through. And then you have the recording pack as a separate unit that you can have over your shoulder so that one person can create video footage. And this was the first time that that was possible. Different models use different recording media. The first ones, I think, were kind of proprietary, and then they went to this U-matic video cassettes. The early units could record up to 30 minutes, which was quite a lot, actually, compared with, say, film. But later on, the duration was extended even to 90 minutes so that you could, for example, go to a protest against the Vietnam War on Capitol Hill in Washington and record 90 minutes without even having to change the cassette that was in the unit. So this was very liberating. Here we have a compact, portable system. One person can operate it. You don't need a whole team. It's standardized and compatible with other systems. Because it became popular, units like this were available all over the place. So it was a lot more available and accessible than other motion video formats. The image quality wasn't great. It was kind of crude, but it did record a decent black and white image and the audio as well. So you did not need a separate audio recorder. And furthermore, it only cost $1,500. Now, $1,500 in 1968 was a lot of money, but we're not talking $150,000 here or $15,000. Basically, Sony brought down the price to access video recording by a huge margin. So Portapak was really an enabling technology. It changed video forever, and it certainly changed video art forever. Suddenly, individuals could afford the means of production. And even if individuals couldn't, small groups, community groups, universities, and so on could afford to buy this equipment and teach other people how to use it. So it enabled what was called guerrilla television, and television created by activists that they could then easily screen for others. And around this, there was a public access system of broadcasters. So it's one thing to be able to create the video, but then how are you going to show it to people? And if the major television networks are kind of locked down in this big corporate structure, you're not going to get access to that. But there was a system across the USA of what was called public access television that came about, especially with cable broadcasting, where broadcast stations no longer needed big transmitters and that expensive stuff. So it was a lot more, again, the price had been brought down for broadcasting. And so these cable companies could serve local communities and local interests more so than national interests. So video artists could now create the content, they could manipulate the content with simple editors, and then they could distribute the content at least in their local community over cable television, and sometimes even further afield. Of course, they could show this stuff in galleries and so on as well to the sort of art gallery audience and market. So here's an image used for an important show, TV as a creative medium. And this was an exhibit at the Howard Wise Gallery in New York City in 1969. So it came after the availability of the Portapak, but when artists were still doing a lot of the direct signal manipulation as well. So I've listed some of the artists and the pieces that were shown at this at this exhibit that I found from numerous sources. I've had to do a lot of reading to figure out what actual pieces were shown there. Some of them are more famous than others, and I'll just discuss one of them in particular, which is this one called Wipe Cycle. So the first interesting thing is that we have an array of 9 television sets, and what they're showing various material. Some of it is pre-recorded videotapes that they're showing, but some of it is live footage of the gallery setup itself. So this live footage includes the audience in the image. So this piece was by Frank Gillette and Ira Schneider, and it got a lot of attention. A lot of other artists were sort of inspired to do video based on this because it placed the viewer in the television image and it had that immediacy. There was no delay. So it really highlighted the advantages of this video technology in that sense. It enfolded the viewer into this sort of the timescape and the mediascape of the television experience. And it also commented on kind of the ubiquity of this technology and how television had become part of everyday life. So again, it's hard to understand the experience of going to a gallery and seeing this type of piece, but it would have been, and it was, quite effective. And I'll bring it up again in my next lecture because it inspired some particular artists that I'm going to talk about at that time. Also in 1969, the Experimental Television Center was formed. It was actually first formed at a university in New York State as the Student Experiments in Television Unit, SET. But in 1971, it moved to a location in Binghamton, in the downtown part of that town. And so it became more embedded in the community as opposed to being embedded in the university. And this television center was typical of those that sprung up around the country and then the world in the services that they offered. So they had this Portapak gear and they offered free access to it. They had editing facilities, they conducted training workshops, they had local public access TV stations that were willing on some occasions to broadcast the resulting material. They expanded into artist residency programs, and to date, over 1,500 artists have been facilitated there. The ETC, Experimental Television Center, is still going. They've got a great website. They had exhibitions and so on. So they did all this stuff. They did this through state funding and corporate donations and university support and managed to pull all this together. So a lot of people went there to work. A lot of really important artists that came out of the community got their start at the ETC. And once again, Nam June Paik was strongly associated with the ETC. He developed this synthesizer I've already mentioned with Shoya Abe. Other people working there, David Jones, a young, talented dude, constructed the Jones colorizer in 1974. So these were machines that people were building from scratch from electronics. And then he expanded that into a keyer, a sequencer, and some oscillators. So he actually got into the synthesis side of things. And then it was quite obvious that computers could be used to control the video flow. And so in that same year, 1975, he began work on a computer control system, which he completed and which worked just fine, with a couple other people. Don MacArthur's another really big name in the technology side of things. And he did a lot of his work in association with the Vasulkas, this couple who are both video artists that I'll discuss in my next lecture. So we'll come back to the Experimental Television Center in the context of particular work next time. Okay, and another group that came together were the publishers of this journal or magazine, however you want to look at it, which was called Radical Software. And I remember years ago hearing about this magazine. You can see number 1, 1970. I remember hearing about it, and I thought it was about software, and it isn't. It's called Radical Software. You might be able to see there it says the alternate television movement, was the name of the first issue. So it was actually about video, but that was considered to be software at the time, in the sense that it was manipulable, even before sort of computers came in to help control video. So there's a brilliant website that puts all of this content up online, so it's all accessible. The journal was started by a few people from the Rain Dance Collective, and they put out 11 issues until 1974, and achieved a circulation of 5,000 readers, which is a lot. I don't know too many journals that have a circulation of 5,000 people. So they had a huge impact on the field. And sure enough, some of the names we've already seen, Tambellini, Paik, Youngblood, were in the first issue. And I want to quote at length from Gene Youngblood's essay, The Videosphere, because it was the first article in the first issue, and it basically acted as a manifesto for this new video movement. Youngblood would go on to write a couple very important books on media art. I won't read all of this, but it's here for you. You can read it at your leisure. The first statement is quite interesting, and I'll explain it more in one moment. The videosphere is the noosphere, global organized intelligence transformed into a perceivable state. So this here is a very optimistic proclamation. It's basically a call, as it ends, with a liberation of the television medium from large centralized corporate control. And as I've already pointed out, the means existed by this point for that to happen. And the statement here, television is one of the most revolutionary tools in the entire spectrum of techno-anarchy. Well, that might have been a bit too optimistic, but it's a great spirit to have when you're setting out to do something. I'll point out as an aside that a lot of these sentiments were very similar to the optimism and the utopian sentiments at the beginning of the computer movement, and then at the beginning of the internet movement. These new technologies are often seen as being liberating, especially when the means of production finally gets put in individual hands. But what is usually not appreciated is the way in which the hegemonic control can still be exerted over that. So nowadays we have YouTube, where anyone can post a video. We have Facebook, where anyone can share media, and yet we know how those are controlled by centralized corporations and the constraints that are put on them. So the optimism has to be tempered with a certain degree of pragmatism as well. But I think as an artist, it's not too bad an idea to err on the side of the optimistic. So I wanted to explain this concept of the noosphere because it comes from one particular kind of a strange character. This guy who's often called Teilhard for short, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was a paleontologist. He studied evolution, but he was also a Christian priest and a mystic. His ideas were not accepted by the church, and they certainly were not accepted by scientists either. He had this idea of the noosphere, which was sort of the end point of evolutionary consciousness. And the idea was it was a global, just like the atmosphere is the air layers that envelop the earth, the noosphere is a global zone of mind. That's what noo means in Greek. I guess it comes from the Greek. It means mind. He was using the sense of spirit as well, particularly Christian spirit. So he felt that all life was evolving towards this point of global mind and spirit. And you can see how this might appeal to certain, say, hippie ideologies or other counterculture thinking at the time, despite the fact that Teilhard was a devout Christian and everything was posed in terms of Christ. Youngblood uses this concept, but obviously in a much more secular manner, not relating it to religion at all. So, Teilhard's main works are available on archive.org if you really want to dredge through them. They are really difficult reading because they're so, what's the right word? They're not well thought out, let's just say. So some of his concepts are more interesting than his writing, for sure. But you will see this. Some of his ideas are sort of paraphrased and used loosely by other thinkers. So finally, for this lecture, I want to just fill in some other names for you of other important engineers, electrical people, and the people I'm calling the hardware gurus on the scene. One of them was Stephen Beck, who created what he called the direct video synthesizer in 1971, when he was only 21 years of age. He was actually working on this stuff, I think, from age 17. He built his first television set from scratch. I mean, that's quite some talent there. But he created this synthesizer to be an electronic sculpting device, those are his own words, to work with 4 primary characteristics: the color, the form, the motion, and the texture of the video image. And a few years later, he updated this to a digitally controlled version that was called the Beck Video Weaver. He was an artist himself, although he never really called himself an artist, but he was artist in residence, for example, at this television center in San Francisco. And he produced various series with other people over the years. His work, some of it has now been made available on YouTube, which is great. His Video Weaver he used to produce a series he called Video Weavings. Makes sense, huh? And there is an example I can show you. Hold on a second. Okay, so you get the idea there. It's very, the music's hilarious. It's some sort of library music that was put over top. So obviously the patterns are coming out of considerations of weaving itself, but also just the square wave generators with the different oscillator frequencies that end up generating the patterns. This sort of work was actually sort of pejoratively described as sort of video wallpaper. I mean, other artists wouldn't have considered this to be of any aesthetic value, but I think it does have value, and some of his other videos that I will link to had quite a playful spirit that I think certainly has a place in video art. So the second name I want to mention is Dan Sandin, who is still with us. And he first trained as a physicist, but then while at school got involved with the student protests in the late 1960s and actually ended up videotaping them. So he got into video through sort of documentary footage of some of the political acts that were happening at the time. He was familiar with the Moog synthesizer, and so he wondered, what would it be like to create a modular, by Moog I mean like the Moog 2, like a big modular setup. So he thought the obvious thought. I'm interested in video. Here's a modular audio synthesizer. What would a modular video synthesizer be like? So he set about building one, and it was unique at the time in that it was modular. So every different component did a different task and could be programmed with patch cables in the same way as a modular synth. So the Sandin image processor was the first version was completed in 1973, And because of his ideals about sharing his work, he documented this as an open source project, although the term open source didn't exist then. And he even provided kits, which is quite common today with electronics, but was unheard of at the time. Here's a guy came up with a video synthesizer. We don't even know what that is. People didn't even know what that was at the time. And you can buy the kits, you can solder it together yourself and create your own at a very low cost. Not too many people had the talents to do that, but some did. And so his ideas really helped disseminate the idea of video synthesis. Later in his career, he worked a lot on stuff associated with virtual reality. For example, he helped design the first data glove with Tom DeFanti and Rich Sayer, and it was called the Sayer glove in 1977. And later, he helped design a formative, really quite important virtual environment, important in the history of virtual reality, which was called CAVE, which stood for Cave Automatic Virtual Environment. I love acronyms like that. So CAVE stands for Cave Automatic Virtual Environment. So it's a recursive kind of algorithm. So he designed that in 1992. And he kept his hand in the game always very creatively. He's professor emeritus now, and is still does lots of cool stuff. I'm sure many of the practitioners out there today in the USA were his students. And the third name I must mention is Bill Etra, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. He was in very bad health after an accident. And he first trained, as a student, he took documentary film, but then he started teaching. Even when he was still a student, he started teaching, that is, but experimental film. And he actually sold his car, his station wagon, I think it was, so he could buy a Sony Portapack. So he really dedicated his time, energy, and all of his money to this field, which eventually bankrupted him, but still, he was very dedicated. And he helped found the center called The Kitchen in 1971, and that will be a matter for the next lecture to discuss that. He worked with Steve Rutt on a system that was inspired by the Abe Paik wobulator, and this became known as the Rutt-Etra synthesizer. Though it was built by hand, they made 20 of them that sold for between $7,000 and $8,000 US each. They were still in debt, however, after all their investments in time, and then they were hit by a lawsuit. And although they didn't lose the lawsuit, the costs of fighting it meant that they basically went bankrupt and they could no longer produce the synthesizer. Now, he created some interesting videos himself. Again, Etra wouldn't primarily be known as an artist, but I think some of the stuff he worked on is well worth looking at as art and as formative material from this time. He often involved his wife Louise in these little short demos, you could call them, even if they're not art films. And he helped direct the first computer art festivals at the Kitchen, which were in 74 and 75. And like the other names, he continued on in the engineering business. So I've used a lot of resources to put together this information. There's no sort of one book that covers this at the moment. And some of these names are very understudied, unfortunately. But there are, if you do your research, there's stuff out there. The Experimental Television Center website is excellent source of information. And I need to explicitly mention the last item on this list, Gene Youngblood's Expanded Cinema from 1970, the same year that the first issue of Radical Software was published. Expanded Cinema is now available in a 50-year anniversary issue that you can buy, and I recommend that you do. It is such an important book that covers all sorts of interesting practice, that combines many different arts together, performance art, dance, and everything with cinema, video, and so on. It's just like a wonderful book to explain some of the back history of this and to also give you inspiration for work you might want to do in the future. So I'll wrap it up there. Wanted to get all this done within an hour, and I think I did. So please avail of the PDF version of this presentation. Check out the pertinent links that I have on the blog as well. The works I showed you and a lot of other ones you can, like Etra, some of Etra's shorts are available there. And you don't know how long they'll be available for before they disappear from the internet. As I just mentioned, some of this material is quite rare and fleeting, despite its historical importance. So I hope this has given you sort of a different strand of thinking about video work that some of you may wish to engage in. There are video synthesizers on the market currently. There are kits you can buy. There are components you can buy for a rack mount system. There are standalone sort of hacked together things. And there's a certain group of practitioners that still engage in signal art and video synthesis. In fact, if anything, it's increased in popularity the last few years with the popularity of Eurorack, for example. And if any of you individually are interested in looking into this, say over the summer, I could help you out with a few sources for it as well. So thanks for your attention, and I'll be back with a continuation of this topic when I look specifically at the work of Steina and Woody Vasulka, which will also involve discussing the establishment of the kitchen in New York and some of the many artists that came out of that scene. This is Robin, signing off.